Welcome to Athletic Wise, where like-minded people come to connect. We focus on sports science and how it applies to the sports we love. In today's edition of the High Performance Speaker Series, we will be discussing metrics gleaned from a new insole technology called Plantiga. Today's guest in the High Performance Speaker Series is Dr. Matt Jordan. Matt has been working with elite athletes for over 6 Olympic cycles. He is currently Director of Sports Science at the Canadian Sport Institute in Calgary. His specialty is in resistance training and the prevention and treatment of ACL injuries. Matt, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I'll start off and I'll ask you some more technical questions on the system and then get into some applications if that's
sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. So I believe metrics, related to injuries such as joint loading impact are largely underreported because the human eye isn't able to identify or quantify it. So wearables have the potential to drastically influence injury rates. So the Plantiga system, maybe it's my bias. I'm a distance runner and I'm pretty curious on the cumulative load. So is Plantiga able to, capture that, like cumulative loads on an athlete?
Yeah, I mean, it's simply put, it's this is actually one of the pods right here, but it's just none of these things are really that when you really see them, they're not that complicated. I mean, it's just an IMU, right? So inside this little piece of plastic is the IMU, and obviously can measure, it's got an accelerometer and a gyroscope and magnetometer, which isn't turned on in the current version that they've got. But with the acceleration, that's been a common measure to quantify the external workload in a whole range of athletic situations. As of today, that was one of as of the inception of the company and the hardware, the acceleration load at the foot is one thing that you can pull out as part of the metrics, the suite of metrics. So you've got a right external load and a left external load, and it's basically just giving a measure of the accelerations at the foot each time the foot hits the ground and is moving through the air.
Yeah, pretty valuable, I guess, for a training session, just to know actual, on the mechanical, loads. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, it's like, it's a lot of technologies, and I don't want to name any per se, because I don't want to get myself in hot water or understate or overstate what's going on, because I haven't worked with a lot of different technologies, but a lot of the GPS monitoring systems, for example, I mean, it's literally just, an accelerometer between the shoulder blades or whatever. And it's giving you that number, is essentially giving you this like player load, acceleration load. There's a lot of different ways that it's been quantified in the literature. But what I like about the Plantiga system, there's been some studies that have looked at, if you've got an accelerometer between the shoulder blades, let's say, how does it line up with what's happening at the foot? And in some of these studies, they'll use like a kind of runway of force plates as you run along, and they'll be trying to correlate what's going on at the foot with what's happening, in terms of what's being measured at the shoulder blades. And it seems that the correlation between them is quite low, primarily because the accelerometer between your shoulder blades is moving around a little bit, and there's some artifact that comes in there. So what's nice about the Plantiga system is that it's kind of tucked in underneath your foot, and so the signal is quite clean, and now you can really understand what your right foot is doing and your left foot, because you're getting each of them independently. That introduces a problem in and of itself, because you got to synchronize these and make sure that they're that they're measuring, I guess, technically the same thing, right? Even though they're two separate devices. But that's one of the advantages of having that under the foot.
And what about as far as integrating? Have you toyed with integration with motion capture or EMG, like maybe perhaps in your own study?
Yeah, we've done some concurrent force plate, and so using the force plates and having the insoles underneath the foot. We've done some jumping analysis, doing like Oh, cyclic jumps and counter movement jumps and consecutive counter movement jumps, a whole bunch of different types of jumps, I guess you could say. And we've also played around with the sensors as it pertains to measuring running speed and walking speed. We haven't done any more anything. We haven't done anything connected with surface EMG at this point, and we haven't done anything with regard to 3D motion capture and kinematics. But using comparing the jump metrics with the stuff that we get from the Plantiga system, there appears to be pretty decent agreement between the two. One thing about the Plantiga system is it's not like the first versions of the algorithms that report the biomechanical measures were analytical algorithms. And so by this means that the computer science team would sit down and they would look at the waveforms, and then they would try to pick out, they basically write a program to try and pick out points, right? So, we think the foot's on here, we think it's off here, and, let's find these points repeatedly in jumps. And then we're going to call that, let's say, flight time or ground contact time. But one of the issues with that is that, you cannot write an analytical algorithm that's going to capture all the crazy ways humans move. And so their push was to develop machine learning to be able to do that. So their machine learning algorithms are trained to kind of know when the foot is on and off the ground, and that's increased the accuracy of the measures. So yeah, I think it's reasonable for use in our world, but certainly it's always good to reproduce that ourselves and make sure.
Mm-hmm. So what's the range in sampling frequency, like / storage of the system?
So the IMUs today are sampling just over 400 hertz. I think they're at 416 hertz. And so that is pretty large amount of data, because 400 samples per second. If you go for, like, I was on a podcast last night with or not a podcast, sorry, a group call with Scott Livingston and a few other individuals. I'm sure you know Scotty. And actually normally we got a whole whack of people that join. Normally Andy O'Brien joins us too. He wasn't on last night. But I went during this hour and a half podcast, I went for a 9-kilometer walk. I just went for a walk, and I keep saying podcast interview. It felt like a podcast because I was listening to Scotty and the others talk. It felt like I was actually listening to a podcast. But, from a 9-kilometer walk over an hour and a half, 400 samples per second, that's a
huge,
massive amount of data. So they're, but, if you want to pick up, like I looked at my average ground contact time, it was just over 500 milliseconds in my walk, and pulling out my limb speed and pulling out my speed of my body center of mass. And, all of these measures to get that accuracy, you really need to be at least probably at least 200 hertz sampling frequency to capture that. So it's the trade-off. And but what's nice is that it can store up to 5 hours of data.
Oh.
So I've never had data loss because it's either tapped out or the memory card's gotten full. And then the power is generated by a super cap. So it's not actually a lithium ion battery. And the super cap is, I don't really know the ins and outs of the chemistry of it, but it charges really quickly. And so it's powered a little bit differently than your classic wearable.
And is it calibrated like an athlete first time use? They would have to take so many steps, and it's calibrated per athlete, or?
Yeah, it's so when these come over from their IMUs that are purchased overseas, and when they come in, they've been calibrated, and by calibrated I mean somebody's obviously kind of done a little bit of rudimentary work to make sure that this thing is reading, like in any sort of orientation and whatever is going on, that it's actually right. So right now it should be minus 9.81 meters per second squared with it not accelerating. And by accelerating, I mean with respect to the Earth in terms of my actual, movement of it. But that that is insufficient for sure for the types of accuracy that you or I might be interested in. I think it'd be sufficient if you were just like, honestly, if you were just like, I want to go for a walk and get a rough sense of what's going on. So what they move towards, and it is a bit of a labor intensive process, but when Plantiga gets them in Vancouver, they put them in a rig that basically requires them to calibrate the orientation and whatnot of the pods, and so they get calibrated then. And then there's a calibration that happens before and at the end of each activity that you do. So if you do like, before I start my run, I've got to stand still for 5 seconds, and then I do it at the end. And what that allows the software to do is to flag any anomalies, because if they do start to go off, or I'm standing there and all of a sudden it's not reading -9.8 run, it's reading, I don't know, -12 or something, then you know that the data is not, there's something wrong. Either I wasn't following protocol or there's something wrong with the hardware. So you do have that little piece in there. And I would argue that, like, for people who have done research or people who are of that sort of, if you've done any sort of data collection before, you're usually pretty amenable to following those sorts of protocols. But certainly, like, some people who aren't, that's a bit of they forget. But that is built in today, yeah.
And they can be used underneath an orthotic, I imagine?
Yeah, they can. Yeah, so they've, I think Paris Orthotics is the one that they partnered with in the Vancouver area. But essentially, you can get them to manufacture an orthotic that has the cutout. It's really, I mean, it's nothing, like, it just Velcros in underneath, right? It's fixed in, but it's not screwed in or anything. It's just got that Velcro on the surface that allows it to sort of squish in underneath the insole. I have a pair of inserts as well that I use when I run, and I just use so it comes with a kind of a thin flexible insole, and I just put that underneath my insert. But I would imagine that if you were, let's say, a track and field athlete, or you were wearing a very form-fitting shoe, you'd probably want to make sure you get it like sized perfectly.
So on that note, different running shoes change, pronation rates, loading rates, that kind of thing. So that's something you could evaluate in terms of shoe recommendations.
Yeah, you can see it, and it's there's these so right now there's no biomechanical measure that Plantiga puts out. Let me rewind a little bit. So you've got these insoles, they're spitting out acceleration in the mediolateral, front to back, up and down directions, and also looking at the position and orientation of what's going on, and all of that raw data is there, right? And then Plantiga takes machine learning and then uses all that data to predict biomechanical variables like stride length and ground contact time and speed and what have you. So there's no measures today that are, I would say, gold standard measures of pronation that are part of the Plantiga platform. But what you can get out is you can get the AX and the position data from Plantiga in terms of we call them movement maps, but they're basically showing what's happening on the right relative to the left in cyclical movements like walking and running. And we've done some little pilot work where we have people with different levels of pronation, or even if we exaggerate pronation in terms of how we walk, and you can definitely pick up in that mediolateral direction, you can pick up increased acceleration at the foot in someone who's walking with excess pronation. So you could technically see it. But where the system obviously would need to go would be nice to have some biomechanical measures that they're able to predict off that, and I think that's in the pipeline.
So speaking of like machine learning, deep learning, by my background in neuroscience, we use that to identify neurological tissue, and as the data set grows, the system improves, so that pattern recognition improves. So is Plantiga using that at all as far as accumulating data and creating normative data sets, like, oh, this is what it should look like, or anything in that regard?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's so specifically, they are using deep learning, and these movement maps that kind of come out of these yeah, this data that's coming in is sort of in the back of my head, kind of represents what the pattern of movement looks like. And then um, through a variety of different projects that they have underway, Plantiga is using machine learning to look at movement patterns. And right now, they're looking at movement patterns. One of the projects that they've got on their docket is one related to the Canadian military, and so they've been looking at particularly the carrying around extra load, carriage load. So you think about military personnel, firefighters, construction, anywhere where you've got to carry extra carriage load around as part of your activity or your job duties. Plantiga's one of their algorithms is predicting the external carriage load. So the idea would be, I'm walking around with 50 pounds in my rucksack, but I look like I'm walking like I have 100 pounds or something like that. So you'd be able to say, flag a movement pattern that's associated with somebody carrying around way more external load than they should be carrying around.
Gotcha.
So that's one. And then the second one that and this is the one I'm most excited about, because I think it lines up with what my interests are, obviously professionally, is the so essentially it's predicting whether or not your movement pattern looks like somebody who's had an ACL injury. And so, it's to that point, collecting a bunch of data on individuals with ACL injuries, where they're starting, and also ankle sprains and Achilles tendinopathies. Those are the three main injury types that they've got now. And then they're, growing that database relative to the normative database population, and using that to basically to extract those insights. And it's pretty cool. Like today, you can go for a 2-minute walk and it'll give you a score. 5 means that your movement patterns look like a healthy person. A 1 means that your movement patterns look like somebody with an ACL injury or a lower body injury. So yeah.
It's obviously very advantageous with the wearables to have, out on the playing field capturing that data. But also if gait modification is needed, a lab, obviously having the biofeedback in the lab is very, very helpful. So if, typically your experience, how long has it taken to work with, like, to adopt a certain gait modification? How many sessions? Do you have any experience with that? Like,
yeah, I mean, we're working on it now. Like, now that we are in a position where the movement maps are becoming a little more accessible through the platform, and also that we've got this movement health score, essentially, which we understand the nuts and bolts of. We are actually working on case studies right now with some of the individuals who are using the system to be able to look at, exactly like you said, either gait modification through cueing, or identifying muscular deficits. So, muscle strength deficits, or, rate of force development deficits, or, eccentric strength capacity deficits at a joint, and being able to identify that with the system, and then, use basically physical training to modify the internal constraints of the organism, so to speak, right? But there's definitely, like, the one limitation I feel like there is today is that you can't you can't get immediate biofeedback. Like you have to take them off, put them on the dock, upload the data, and then you can see the data. It doesn't take long, it makes 5-10 minutes. But if you were wanting to be in a position where you were going to, make an adjustment and see what happened and give feedback, like the system doesn't allow you to do that today. But what the system does allow you to do is you could be inside a single recording, and then you could say, for example, cue to walk a certain way, or you've given some instruction, or you've given some, and you could tag that, and then you could compare. You could compare in a single data collection different interventions, and then upload it all, and then see everything all together. But I think that's the next frontier, in my opinion, is really starting to use this in a more targeted way to gate retraining, and also to flag deficits and be able to modify them.
Yeah, speaking of gait retraining, in terms of, let's say, running, you've been running for years, and we developed this certain, we developed basically the most efficient movement pattern for us. Do you think in general there's a lot of improvement that still can be made in terms of economy?
I'm gonna say, I don't know the answer to that question. I do think about it in terms of studies on, human mechanical efficiency. And, I think the estimates in, the top cyclists of the world is that humans are about 25 to 30% efficient in terms of internal metabolic energy relative to external work done. So I'd like to think that you could, it doesn't sound like we're overly efficient, just even in the best of times. But I don't know how trainable that is. I do think that this tool would allow us to explore that possibility, though. Obviously, if you could, you can see and this has always been my thoughts as a coach or as a performance consultant, is every training program you write and every cue you give is almost like a little mini science experiment, where you've got a hunch, a working hypothesis that if you do X, Y, it'll cause Y. And very often we're kind of left guessing whether did we achieve Y, or did it, do we think we achieved it, or are we all just sort of agreeing we achieved it, or we hope we achieved it? But I do think that this might be a way to kind of capture that a little bit more objectively. But I don't know. I know this isn't my interview, but I'd be curious to know what you think, being an endurance athlete.
Well, yeah, I do think there's such a, like, it's almost like an inverse relationship, like in research has been, in terms of economy and ground contact time.
Mm-hmm.
It's more economical to have a lower, a higher contact time. But that it's a trade-off. It depends how long you're going. It's very different between obviously a sprinter and a long distance athlete. So
Mm-hmm.
and I think one of the real strengths of having a system such as Plantiga is take, for example, RSI and looking at plyometrics, and like you say, being there and having that data is, I think, extremely valuable, because if you're looking, okay, I want to improve, instead of just throwing a box or a hurdle in front of someone, you can actually identify, going, well, what metric are we trying to actually target? Is it, an improvement on power, or is it ground contact time? And using RSI, you could actually completely tweak that.
Yeah. I think you, I think that's always been my hope, working along with this system, is to be able to, have that technology that's a little bit more accessible, that would allow us to answer some of these bigger questions. And, I definitely think that, to really get more granular, I've used the Strava app, and I've used my Garmin watch, and, I get, some rough idea of how far I ran and how fast I ran. But I find the granularity in some of the biomechanical measures very useful and interesting. And I mean, I'm not looking at endurance, elite endurance athletes or endurance athletes in general, but certainly with injuries, right? Like that's something we want to know. Like, I want to know, if you are spending more time on one side than the other, or if there's a change in limb speed. That's been a really interesting one. Just it's still kind of in its beta form, so I'm always careful to say that, you know, I'm always careful to not make it seem as though these things are fully baked and fully established. Some of these are beta, right? Like it's just like any technology, you've got to take time to work out the kinks. But the limb speed one, anecdotally, like it's really interesting to note that somebody who can be injured and it's like everything else seems fine, but the one leg just moves more slowly in the air, right? And it's like, wow, isn't that interesting? It's nothing to do with how they are with the foot on the ground. It's like, you know, the cycling through the air that's different one side to the other. I just think that each of these puzzles, to be honest with you, is kind of like its own little unique puzzle to be figured out.
Yeah.
You know, how to improve and where to focus.
Yeah. Speaking of asymmetry, you know, we think of, you know, let's say hand dominance, 90% of people are right hand dominant. But in terms of lower limb, it's, you know, 25 to 45% of right leg preference. So for you as a, you know, as a scientist, do you try and achieve like a symmetry of 90%? What do you think that threshold is to be, you know, a healthy athlete, like across the board strength and, you know, is there any kind of range?
I think you gotta, I think it's helpful to think about it in two different ways. There's symmetry and capacity, right? So when I think about capacity, I think about muscle strength, rate of force development, power. And, you know, to this end, you know, we want the capacities on the one side to be close to the capacities on the other. So that means my muscle strength, rate of force development, power, my jump height, things that are outputs are, I think that threshold of 10% is definitely almost probably even a little bit too generous. I think that most of the time what we see is that, you know, and I mean, it's not uncommon to see people have capacity deficits side to side more than 10%. Happens all the time. But I think that, you know, when you see, you know, very well-trained individuals who are doing the right amounts of single leg training, and they're doing the right amounts of training with the right person watching and working with them so that their capacities are being sort of, they're achieving this with the right movement strategy as well, right? So I think what we see is that the occurrences of these capacity deficits of more than 10% are relatively few and far between. So, but then there's this idea. So if we move from capacity to ability, like, you know, stride by stride, walk by walk, you know, run by run, you know, we're always asymmetrical. Like it's actually not the case that our movements are perfectly symmetrical all the time. And this is me taking my science cap off now and just really talking more as a performance consultant and a coach and just my feeling. So completely unfounded scientific statement here, but like, I think it's a big problem in today's modern age strength and conditioning is we're teaching everybody for these like perfect positions and movements and like, you know, like, gosh, you know, I'm guilty of this too, so no judgment. But you know, the number of times I've like corrected every little minutia to get the person in the perfect posture and position, and you know, it's like little robots, you know, moving down the track. I think that we've almost done a disservice by coaching the variability out. So we're making everybody really rigid, and you know, I don't want to say that there's correlation here because this is me just talking like a coach and just the free living of like, you know, not having to have any evidence to support this or not. But like you think about the NFL, like there's probably never been more investment in strength and conditioning and medical and physiotherapy and all these things that we're doing. Yet not only has the injury rates remained stable, it might almost be worse than ever. You know, like people they're blowing their knees left, right, and center every weekend. You know, there's ACL injuries, it's everywhere. Like it's just, I mean, maybe we're just more aware of it, but I think, yeah, you know, really when you look at it, it's almost like you have to ask the question, like, what is it that we're missing? And I think one of the things that we're missing is that human movement is variable, and it's meant to be variable. And you have degrees. It goes back to Bernstein, right? Bernstein's models of human movement, that, you know, you've got these massive degrees of freedom, which permit, and you control the degrees of freedom by self-organizing, and you find the optimal solution for you and for the task, given the constraints and given the environment. And that's that idea of like constraints led. I mean, you know, it's kind of constraints led learning has sort of evolved into this idea of ecological dynamics or systems approach, right? But I think at the end of the day, it's like this notion that you are not trying to coach perfectly symmetrical movement. That cannot be the outcome, because it's not how humans move. And at the end of the day, it's almost interesting to note that when you look at movement asymmetry, and I always differentiate the limb symmetry, i.e., like I'm trying to emphasize that we're trying to get symmetry and capacity. I'm as strong on one side as I am on the other, right? My outputs are the same, meaning that I don't have a really weak left leg and a really, really strong left leg or right leg, sorry, that might be problematic. But the idea of movement asymmetry, now we're actually looking to see that there is some variability in how we move, and that we're trying to find and identify patterns that are more a matter of like, did the pattern of asymmetry change? Are they displaying a rigid limb loading pattern over multiple movement cycles or multiple sessions? And certainly, you know, when I think about Plantiga, you can look at capacity, like you can look at jump height and single leg RSI and whatnot, but you can also extract this idea of movement asymmetry over a 9-kilometer walk. And you know, I was on average last night, I think I was on average about 2% asymmetry right side dominant, but that was like literally over the entire bandwidth of my walk. And then if I look at the peaks, it's like, oh wow, they're just all over the place. There's a little bit of movement, and sometimes it's a little more right, sometimes it's a little more left, sometimes it's a lot more right, sometimes it's a lot more left, you know, but then it all averages out over this whole long thing that I'm pretty symmetrical on average.
Yeah, just
but
like
stride by stride, I wasn't.
Oh, that like HRV is a good thing, right? High HRV.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's the one that I often use when I'm trying to compare like movement asymmetry. Is I'll compare it with HRV, and there's a sweet spot. Like there's a variability sweet spot where it's like Goldilocks, right? Like too much variability and too little are both probably signs that something is not quite right with the system.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic, Matt. I really, really appreciate it. It certainly gives me a better idea of the system and the potential uses there. So that was that was great. Really, really appreciate your time. And I guess if anyone wants any more information, they can look you up. Do you want to direct our viewers anywhere in particular?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, you know, you can. My website is a great way to access me directly. It's jordanstrength.com. And my Twitter and Instagram handles are Jordan Strength. So anybody who wants to, find me can find me there. I tend not to be I'm not an aggressive social media person. I'm usually maybe once or twice a week or something like that at the most. I maybe put something out so you won't get bombarded. But if you do want to know more about the Plantiga platform, they're really helpful. I mean, there's still a small company, and there's still kind of like, you're going to, call up, you're going to talk to the owner, you're going to talk to the people that are like, it's not a, it's a very human connected company that way. And so plantiga.com is their website, and they're also on social media. But through one of those channels, if you're interested in learning more, reach out. I think like, I keep saying to them that, when I first got introduced to this, I was like, oh, wow, this is going to be great for injuries. But it was interesting at the time, they were interested in monitoring load in team sport. And I was like, yeah, I guess it would be good with team sport, but like team sport already has like Catapult and all these others. And so then it's been this like injury rehab push, which has been great. That's right up my alley. But as I use it more myself, and I'm not the endurance athlete I used to be. I used to be a kind of a high level triathlete, and but I'm still nerdy enough that when I go for a run, I like to kind of know what's going on. And I keep saying to them, I'm like, guys, you should really think about putting these in the hands of some runners. Like I just know myself, like I don't have the same importance around it as I used to because I'm not performing. But I was like, you should really get some like competitive runners and see what they think about it, because I'm sure they give you amazing feedback on what they're doing and what they're seeing.
Yeah.
So I think it might be a runner's dream. But
Yeah, the quantifiable self, and I fully
yeah,
disclose that. I love the metrics science nerd, so that's
me too.
I'm all over it.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
thanks
me
again,
too.
Matt. That was super helpful, very informative.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was fun to catch up.
Okay, really appreciate it.